You're flying into Dubai expecting the impossible. Cranes stretching across the horizon, steel rising out of the desert, a city that never stops building, a skyline that keeps evolving in real time. That's the image Dubai has sold to the world for decades. But as the plane begins to descend, something feels off. The skyline is still there, the towers still shine, everything looks complete, but the movement is gone. The cranes are missing. And that absence creates a strange kind of silence, because those cranes were never just part of the scenery. They were a signal, a constant reminder that the city was still growing, still expanding, still pushing forward. And now, suddenly, that signal has disappeared. So here's the question almost nobody is asking. What happens when the fastest-growing city on Earth suddenly stops growing? Because this isn't just a slowdown, and it doesn't feel temporary. Something deeper is happening beneath the surface, something that isn't immediately visible but is quietly reshaping the future of the city itself. For more than 2 decades, Dubai sold a very specific promise: endless growth. Bigger towers, more ambitious projects, and a skyline that would never stop evolving. It wasn't just about construction, it was about identity. The world's tallest building, the largest mall, artificial islands shaped like entire continents. Dubai wasn't trying to compete with other cities, it was trying to outpace imagination itself. And for a long time, it worked. Investors poured in billions of dollars. Developers launched mega projects before the previous ones were even completed, and cranes became a symbol of certainty. As long as Dubai kept building, it meant Dubai was winning. That belief became deeply embedded in how people understood the city. Growth wasn't just expected, it was assumed. But what made that belief powerful also made it fragile, because it depended entirely on one idea staying true: that growth would never stop. And once that assumption starts to break, everything connected to it begins to shift. At first, the changes were subtle, easy to dismiss. A few delayed projects here, a quieter construction site there. Developers began using softer language, words like stabilization, adjustment, strategic pause. It sounded controlled, planned, almost reassuring. But if you looked closer, the pattern was different. Entire plots of land remained untouched. Half-finished towers stood frozen in place. Construction equipment sat idle under the desert sun. There was no urgency, no momentum. What once felt like constant motion began to feel like stillness. And stillness, in a city built on movement, is hard to ignore. This wasn't a temporary pause. It was something else, something quieter, but more significant. It was the absence of forward momentum. And in a system that depends on continuous expansion, that absence starts to raise uncomfortable questions. Then the data began to confirm what the skyline was already suggesting. In 2024, new construction permits in Dubai dropped dramatically, by nearly 90%. A city that once approved project after project suddenly stopped issuing them at scale. Even more striking was what didn't happen. For the first time in over 20 years, there were no approvals for skyscrapers above 50 stories in a single quarter, not fewer, none at all. That's not a slowdown. That's a complete shift in behavior, because when a city like Dubai stops approving major projects, it's not because it lacks ambition, it's because something in the underlying equation has changed, and when that equation changes, the effects ripple through everything connected to it. At first glance, the explanation seems simple. Dubai ran out of space, not in a physical sense. The desert still stretches endlessly, but the valuable space, the locations investors actually want, is nearly gone. Prime areas like downtown, Marina, and Business Bay are already heavily developed. These are the zones that defined Dubai's rise, the places where demand was strongest. And now, they're almost fully built. That changes the economics entirely, because once the best locations are taken, new projects become harder to justify. The appeal decreases, the risk increases, and suddenly expansion is no longer as simple as it once was. But space alone doesn't explain everything, because the real issue runs deeper. The bigger problem is oversupply. For years, developers built based on projections, not actual demand. They assumed growth would continue indefinitely, so they kept building. More towers, more units, more luxury developments. But demand didn't keep pace. And when supply grows faster than demand, the imbalance becomes unavoidable. Entire buildings began operating below expected occupancy levels. Investors struggled to find tenants. Units remained empty for extended periods. What once looked like a thriving market started to reveal a different reality. Because a building without people isn't just underused, it becomes a financial burden. Maintenance costs continue, loans remain unpaid, and the value of the asset begins to shift from opportunity to liability. But there's another layer most people miss. Dubai didn't just overbuild homes, it overbuilt expectations. Investors weren't just buying apartments, they were buying projections. Promises of 8 to 10% rental yields, assumptions of constant appreciation. But when real rental returns dropped closer to 3 to 4%, the entire equation changed. Suddenly, the numbers didn't justify the price. And when the math breaks, confidence follows. Investors who once rushed into the market started hesitating. Some tried to exit, others held on, maybe hoping the market would recover. But hesitation spreads quickly, and once momentum slows, it becomes very difficult to restart. At the same time, the cost of building increased sharply. Since 2022, construction costs have risen significantly, driven by materials, labor, and logistics. Financing also became more difficult. Global interest rates climbed, making large-scale projects harder to justify. What once looked like a profitable investment began to carry more risk. Developers had to rethink their approach, because the numbers no longer supported the same level of expansion. Projects that would have been approved easily a few years earlier now required deeper scrutiny, and in many cases, they simply didn't move forward. The financial equation had changed, and when the math stops working, and even the most ambitious plans begin to slow down. Another critical shift happened on the demand side. The investors themselves changed. For years, Dubai attracted speculative buyers, people who purchased properties not to live in them, but to sell them later at a higher price. This worked as long as prices kept rising, but once growth slowed, that model became unstable. Today's investors are more cautious. They are looking for stable returns, real occupancy, and long-term value. And many of Dubai's luxury projects don't offer that anymore. The focus has shifted from speculation to sustainability, and that shift has reduced demand for new developments. Because without constant flipping, the market behaves very differently. Behind the scenes, developers have already started adapting. But this transition is happening quietly. Instead of announcing new mega projects, the focus has shifted toward improving what already exists. Retrofitting buildings, enhancing efficiency, adding smart technology, making existing properties more livable. Because the real challenge is no longer building more, it's filling what has already been built. This is a fundamental shift in strategy, from expansion to optimization, from growth to maintenance. And while it may appear subtle, it represents a major change in how the city operates. There's also an environmental and regulatory dimension that's shaping this shift. Dubai's newer urban plans now emphasize sustainability, energy efficiency, and livability rather than pure expansion. High-rise buildings consume enormous amounts of energy, especially in a desert climate. Cooling alone represents a massive ongoing cost. As global pressure increases around sustainability, large-scale luxury developments become harder to justify both financially and environmentally. This adds another layer of constraint. Growth is no longer just about building bigger, it's about building smarter, and that requires a completely different approach. From the outside, this can look like decline, fewer cranes, fewer projects, less visible growth, but internally it's often described differently, as maturity, a shift from being the biggest to being more sustainable, a move toward balance. But there's a tension in that idea, because Dubai's identity was built on constant expansion, and when that expansion slows, the city has to redefine itself. not just economically, but psychologically. The narrative changes, the expectations shift, and that transition is not always smooth. This isn't just Dubai's story. It's a preview of a broader pattern. Cities around the world have followed similar models: rapid expansion, investor-driven growth, assumptions that demand will always catch up. And now, many of them are facing similar questions. Miami, London, Singapore, all showing signs of oversupply in luxury segments. Dubai simply reached that point faster, and because of its scale, the shift is more visible. It shows what happens when growth reaches its limits, and what comes next. Because in the end, the era of infinite expansion doesn't last forever. Every system reaches a point where it has to stabilize, where growth slows, where priorities change, and when that happens, the signals become visible. In Dubai's case, one of the clearest signals is the absence of cranes. Because those cranes represented more than construction. They represented belief, a belief that the future was always being built. And now, that belief is evolving. So the next time you look at Dubai's skyline, don't just focus on what's there, focus on what's missing. Because sometimes absence tells a more important story than presence. And the real question now isn't how high the city can go, it's whether it can sustain everything it has already built. So what do you think? Is this a natural evolution or the beginning of a deeper shift? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want more deep investigative stories like this, subscribe, because sometimes the biggest changes don't arrive with noise. They arrive quietly, and by the time you notice them, they're already underway.